Hello, I'm Amelia Morani, and as part of my graduate studies at Grand Canyon University, I've been asked to create a slide-based video on action potentials in neurons. Before I move on to each subsequent slide, I will pause for a second to afford you time to pause the video, perhaps take notes or write questions. All right, let's begin. Welcome back. First, let's look at an agenda of how we're going to approach action potentials in neurons today. First, we'll look at a setting of where these action potentials take place. Next, we'll look at the voltage profile associated with an action potential. We'll look at the currents associated with that voltage profile. We'll look at the channels associated with those currents. And lastly, we'll look at some of the characteristics of combining all these channels in the forming of an action potential. I'll meet you on the next slide. This slide shows a drawing of a neuron. Not all neurons are the same, but they all have an axon, which is shown here. And let me see, right here, from here to here, the axon has a myelin sheath, which is formed by Schwann cells, and in between each Schwann cell are nodes of Ranvier. The action potential runs along that length of the axon from the axon hillock to the axon terminal. At the axon hillock, there's a cell body, and the cell body is going to have a nucleus and a dendrite. In this cell type, it's going to have a dendrite. Great, I'll meet you on the next slide. This slide shows us the voltage profile of an action potential. We're looking at membrane potential in millivolts as a function of time in milliseconds. More particularly, the inside of the cell relative to the outside of the cell. What do we mean by that? Well, at resting potential, minus 70 millivolts, the inside of the cell is 70 millivolts negative relative to the outside of the membrane with respect to voltage. At resting membrane potential, a graded potential will raise the membrane potential 10 or 20 millivolts, at which point the action potential begins, raising the difference between the two potentials to 0. And about halfway through the action potential profile, the inside and the outside of the cell are at equal potentials, rises to a maximum of about plus 35 millivolts before repolarizing or becoming more and more negative, and temporarily goes just a little more negative than resting potential. All right, next we'll look at the currents associated with our voltage profile. Okay, this slide shows us the currents associated with that voltage profile, where again, we have the voltage profile shown, membrane potential in millivolts as a function of time in milliseconds. And here is our action potential voltage profile. We're going to have sodium currents, or INA, sodium ions, during the upstroke of the action potential predominantly, and we're going to have a potassium current during the repolarization or the downward voltage trajectory of the action potential. Our sodium current is going to go from extracellular through intracellular space in this direction, and the potassium current is going to go from the intercellular space to the extracellular space. And now let's look at the channels that facilitate the passage of each sodium ion, which is responsible for the sodium current, and the channels associated with the passage of potassium ions, which form the potassium current. Turning first to the sodium current, and reminding ourselves that the sodium current is moving from the extracellular space to the intracellular space. It moves down its concentration gradient, which is near 10-fold. This is a block diagram, if you will, representing the sodium channel in 1, 2, 3 different states, beginning at resting potential or state 1. If this little knob here is the activation gate in stage 1, at resting membrane potential, the activation gate is closed. The inactivation gate is represented by this little, they call ball and chain, and you can see it's not occluding the cytoplasm opening of the channel, where this is the extracellular space and this is the intracellular space in each of our 3 configurations. As the cell membrane reaches threshold potential, the sodium channel opens, the activation gate separates. Sodium ions are able to flow down their concentration gradient from extracellular space to intracellular space. The inactivation gate is still in its original position or hasn't fully occluded the pore. The cell continues to depolarize, and by the time the membrane potential is near its most positive inside relative to outside, the inactivation gate has closed or occluded that opening of the channel from the cytoplasm side, and you can see there's no ions that are either going back up their concentration gradient or down from extracellular space to intracellular space. Then after the 3rd stage, the cell repolarizes, and upon repolarization, the inactivation gate returns to its original position and the activation gate closes. And from this stage, again, the cell is ready to perform in another action potential. All right, let's next look at the potassium channel. Turning to our next slide, looking at channels associated with the potassium current. Kindly recall that the potassium current goes down its concentration gradient. In turn, it runs from the intracellular space to the extracellular space. Potassium channels have multiple types. There's multiple sequences and conformations associated with potassium channels, both within a neuron and across neuron types. This is one model of one particular type of potassium channel. It's shown here in its activated state, where there's an opening from the cytoplasm and hydrated potassium enters the channel and passes through a filter. The channel is going to be activated above 0 millivolts and below the peak of the action potential at plus 35 millivolts. It's going to become inactivated as the cell repolarizes. So it's going to, in this example, pinch off the opening to the cytoplasm at resting potential. And that's all we want to cover on this slide. Let's turn our attention now into various attributes associated with the combination of these channels. So when we sum together the sodium channels, plural, and the potassium channels, plural, they give us the voltage profile of an action potential, which is again shown here, membrane potential, as a function of time. One characteristic of the action potential is that it has a higher or faster rate of rise than it does a rate of fall. The sodium current is mainly associated with the rise in action potential, and the potassium channel and potassium currents are associated with the repolarizing or rate of fall of the action potential. The nodes of Ranvier comprise multiple sodium channels and potassium channels. Underneath the Schwann cells, these channels associated with the action potential are absent. So there's a localization of sodium and potassium channels at the nodes of Ranvier. And lastly, let's think of suggested ideas for further study of the action potential. So we've covered a number of things regarding action potentials in neurons today, but there's always room for further study. And I have one suggested question for you, and that is the sum of the sodium ion entry equal to or near equal to the sum of the potassium ion exit in a given action potential? I have a reference list for you on the following slide, and please feel free to email me with any questions or comments. Thank you for your time. Bye.